Hello everyone. So, we are going to continue our discussion on incremental and transformational change. You remember in the last class we have been talking about theory of punctuated equilibrium, and that discussion was there that when we are moving from incremental change to radical change, sometimes the spikes that is created by reactions or sudden changes which comes to be known as incremental changes. So, from incremental changes to what you call radical changes. So, we will continue our discussion further in this direction and discuss some other issues related to these two kind of changes. Now, if you look at this equilibrium that we have been talking about, now you can see that we had been talking about this equilibrium here and see that there is a sudden spike that comes out and then again continuous changes happens and again there is a sudden spike and then again the incremental change happens. Now, the question that is being raised is that whether we could continue to have this kind of equilibrium without having a spike. So, the idea is that is it possible for managers to break this pattern of punctuated equilibrium or not. So, it is possible only if they are not going to react to the changes that is happening to the environment. The idea is that they should continuously scan the environment and see what is happening and accordingly keep on making certain changes on a continuous basis. So, if they keep on making changes on a continuous basis, then we can say that yes, this kind of equilibrium will not be there and then you are going to have a something like this. This is showing something that is a continuous equilibrium, right. So, continuously adopting the changes and moving upwards, that is you are trying to improve your systems, structure, processes, culture and technology by bringing about certain changes and as and when it is required by looking at those issues which is coming from the environment. Now, if we are able to break this equilibrium, then it can be said that you are going to be more proactive, not reactive. So, if you are reactive, it means something is happening in the environment and then you are reacting to this environment, and if you are reacting, then this kind of a spike would be created. There is a sudden jump and this is a result of the reaction, and this reaction would also be required because you need to transform your organization, right. So, sometimes it is not under your control and you need to react, but most of the time what happens, you need to ensure that there is a continuous increment that happens in terms of changes that is happening, right. So, when we are asking this question that whether we can break the equilibrium, yes, we can very much break the equilibrium provided we are able to correctly predict the environment and the factors which are going to affect the organization. So, in some cases if you are not able to predict those factors which are going to affect our organization, then sometimes this kind of change is inevitable and you need to go for transformational changes, but in most cases it does not happen and you continuously adopt and try to improve upon the things which is shown here. See, the continuous graduation increment is happening here. So, you are continuously improving and trying to perform your job very well. Now, the next question is that how we go about continuous adaptation. As I told you that if you are in a position to continuously adapt to the environmental factors, then it is possible. So, for what is required? You need to see that you have a thorough understanding of those environmental factors which are going to affect the organization, and on a continuous basis you are scanning your environment, identifying those factors, looking at your domain in which you are working and see what kind of changes would require on a regular basis or continuous basis. So, if you are acting like that, then it would be called an adaptive organizations. Adaptive organizations means which are continuously adapting to the changes that is happening in the environment. So, if you become an adaptive organizations, then you always experience continuous change, right, because on a regular basis you have been scanning your environment, identifying the domain and then accordingly working upon that. Okay. So, basically this kind of change that happens is prescribed or described as in the gradualist paradigm. Gradualist paradigm is nothing else, but when we gradually keep on moving and changing the things in the organization, depending upon the requirement of the organization as a result of the trigger that is coming from the environment. So, if you are going for a continuous adaptation, then you need to engage in certain activities, and that is what the next thing that we are going to discuss is, it requires organizations to engage in repeated patterns, repeated activities of things, and this includes improvisation. Improvisation is what? So, suppose you have been adapting certain work processes or systems. So, you need to see whether this system is working effectively or not, whether it is efficient or not. So, if the system is not working efficiently or the process is not working efficiently, then you need to go for change in the process, and this kind of change in the process need to be done on a continuous basis. So, if you keep on modifying your system's structure and processes, so this is a case of improvisation. For example, you have developed a structure for your organization which is functional. Now, the organization is growing. Now, you know that this functional structure is would not be appropriate. So, you go for restructuring the organization, right. So, in the process of restructuring, what you do? You see that in what way you can make this structure more efficient, so that there is a better coordination vertically and horizontally, right. So, you go for some kind of restructuring, and from functional you move to some other kind of a structure, maybe division based, maybe product based, right, or you move from a vertical structure to a horizontal structure, right. So, if you are going for these kind of changes, then this is known as improvisation. Say, take another example of recruitment practices. So, if you look at recruitment practices and find that recruitment practices is not cost effective and you are not able to get good candidates for the organization, then definitely you need to modify your recruitment practices. So, you need to assess your recruitment practices and see what kind of changes you need to brought in. How can you make it more effective, more efficient, more cost effective, right. So, suppose you want to introduce technology, or you are moving to an online recruitment system to make it more cost effective. So, this is the kind of improvisation that you want to make in the work practices, right. So, if you go for a regular modification of your work practices, then you do not need to go for a sudden change or transformational changes. Then second part is translation. This translation is basically involves the editing side pocket. This involves basically editing and imitations of idea as they travel through the organization. What does it mean to say is that when you are going for continuous adaptation, it means that you try to see that what other organizations are doing and what other people are following through, imitating those ideas which are effective for the organization. So, if anybody is coming out with a good idea, then you see that whether this idea can be translated into reality or not. Suppose somebody in the management or from the worker side suggests certain changes, then he comes out with the idea that if we do it like this, then probably it will be more effective. Then you must look into this idea, that whether this idea could be further translated into reality or not. So, whenever these ideas are coming, then you keep on testing them, translating them into reality. This would help you to go for more continuous adaptation. And then learning and new insights, that is very important, okay. Because organizations always learn from their past. So, see that how the way you have been doing businesses, the way you have been handling problems, see what the kind of opportunity that have been available in the past, and then you scan the environment and see what kind of opportunities are there. How are you going to look at the problems that you have handled in the past, and see the learning that has come from problem solving, how those learning can be used to solve problems in the future. Okay. So, the kind of learning that happens in terms of experiences, intuitions, judgments that organizations make could be used to facilitate change, to see that in what way organizations can improve their efficiency and efficiency, to ensure that there is a better productivity, better performance on the organizational side. Everyone is happy, whether it is stakeholders, whether it is people or employee in the organization, or even the organization and the management. So, the organizations continuously need to learn from their past also identify ideas about the future and see and work upon those new insights which has been emerging out of those learning experiences, and then make use of them to ensure that this is going to help them to go for more continuous adaptation, not moving to more transformational changes. Now, there are certain exceptions where we do not get this kind of equilibrium. It means that there are certain organizations who continuously improvise, modify, test new ideas, try to become more innovative, improvise themselves. So, this kind of punctuated equilibrium does not happen for them. It means they do not experience the kind of reactions, a spike in their pattern of change that happens and that we had discussed in the past. It means it is a more continuous change like this going straight away. There is no spike like this one as we have seen earlier. Now, where you can find these kind of exceptions in equilibrium, especially if you look at those learning organizations. So, when we are talking about learning organizations, they are identified as those organizations who continuously innovate and improve themselves in terms of their processes, in their systems, right, their structure, their culture. So, what they do basically, they continuously innovate and improve, and these organizations are called learning organizations, right. So, learning organizations basically learn from what is happening in the organizations through the systems, processes. They have a feedback system also, right. So, this is basically related to what we call organizational learning. So, how organizations learn? Organizations collectively learn through teams, through individuals, through systems and processes, and then they try to continuously adopt and improve themselves. So, they come out with new product, new systems, new processes, okay, and they continuously do it, because learning organization is not something that we call an end state. Suppose today an organization, if it is called a learning organization, not necessary that tomorrow it is going to be called a learning organization. So, if the organization will continue to be a learning organization only when they continuously improve and innovate themselves. The indications that organizations who have been in the top 50 or top 100 organizations in terms of their ranking have gone down, because later on they did not go for continuous improvement and innovations. Okay. So, it is very important for organizations to continue to remain at the top, and it is possible when only when they continue to remain as learning organizations, that is going for improvement and innovations. But these kind of organizations are very few, okay, who go for experimentations, innovations, they try to learn as much as possible to bring about change in their products and services to ensure that they remain competitive and viable in the market. So, if they are behaving in this manner, then definitely they will not like to experience, they would not experience any kind of spike, and they would follow the gradualist paradigm, where they continuously try to adapt and improve themselves. Now, there is another exception for punctuated equilibrium, especially for those companies which operates in niche markets or in slow moving circuits. Okay. The reason that these companies do not experience punctuated equilibrium, or they do not go for more transformational change at any point of time, they follow continuous improvement, is because the kind of environment in which they are operating does not change as much. Okay. So, if the environment is not changed, they are working in an environment that is more stable, less dynamic, and if they are working in such an environment, then what will happen? They does not require any kind of change in the structure, system or process, right. So, the changes, basically the pressures or the triggers for the change come from the environment. Now, if the environment is not changing, the factors which are affecting the environment will remain stable, or the frequency of those factors which go for these kind of changes is not there. I mean, how frequently these environmental factors keep on changing, say technology. With that, if the technology is stable, then you do not need to go for a change. If the economic environment, say social cultural environment, say consumers' taste and preferences does not change, or there is very slow movement towards the change, then what will happen? means that even you continue to work in the similar fashion and there is no point going for a change or anything like that. So, these kind of organizations who are operating in slow moving markets or in niche markets where there is not much change, they do not encounter any kind of change related to the environment and there is no transformation in their basic structure, system and processes. So, they continue to work in the similar way. So, they do not face any kind of equilibrium that could be punctuated by spikes. Now, the third one is those kind of organizations which can absorb fats. What I mean to say that those organizations which are well off, which are very financially very sound, right, which can function without transforming themselves, they also go for gradual changes, because they have sufficient fat to absorb. They are financially very good, but if some of the units are not working effectively, whenever there is a loss or some of them are not efficient, they are inefficient, even then it does not matter much. Especially some of the big organizations which have multiple units, this kind of experience is seen, where some of the units are doing very well, they make profits, but while some of the units do not make very well. But since organization is able to observe these kind of inefficiencies, it does not matter and they do not go for a change, right. Whether it is good or not, that is a different thing, because maybe if you are how long you keep on absorbing fats, that is another question that will come out. Okay. Because most of the organizations in today's competitive environment need to remain lean and thin, otherwise they would not be able to compete. So, even if you have lot of fat to absorb your inefficiencies, it would take only some time for you to go out of your business. So, it is very very important for these organizations to realize the need for change, so that even if they can absorb inefficiencies, they are able to transform them to ensure that they continue to remain competitive, right. So, sooner or later they are going to transform them. The point is that it is always good that as early as possible they are able to realize that yes, the fight is not going to last long enough, and so one day they need to go for some kind of transformational changes. They should go for it, otherwise if they do not realize, they keep on absorbing efficiencies, and since they have enough financial backing, they continue to do the things in a similar way. But eventually what happens, how long these fights are going to help them to remain competitive? The day will come that they will not remain competitive. Okay. So, after discussing this equilibrium which we have been discussing since last 2 sessions, that how this happens, another concept that we would like to discuss here is known as strategic drift, which is related to what we have been talking about, exceptions related to punctuated equilibrium. So, when we have been talking about punctuated equilibrium, you have seen that we have been seeing that if you continuously modify, continuously improve and innovate yourself, then this kind of sudden spike is not experienced by you. You continue to do like this, right. So, what happens if you are not able to go for with the changes? You are not able to recognize what is happening in your immediate environment. Okay. So, the concept of strategic drift basically talks about an event or a phenomena where organizations are not able to keep pace with the changes in the environment. So, the reason is that they do not scan the environment, they do not find what are the factors which are changing and how these changing factors of the environment are going to influence them. So, if you are not going to take care of the environment and follow them to bring about certain changes, the result would be what? Your slow and gradual demise. You continue to remain reactive for some time, but ultimately what happens? It goes down. Now, if you look at this, this actually shows strategic drift. So, what happens? It is there, but after that you even incremental changes are not possible. The reason for this kind of strategic drift is that firms do not assess their environmental factors on a regular basis. So, if you ignore the changes that is happening in the external environment, that is social, political, cultural, economic, technical environment, then you cannot keep pace with the changes that is happening in the environment. So, what happens if you are not going to keep pace with the changes that is happening in the external environment, you do not adopt them, because you are not in a position to adopt, because you lag behind, right. Say for example, your technology, you do not go for a change in your technology, while other companies, other organizations in the similar sector have improved and modified their technology a lot, which has brought efficiency to them. And since you have been doing well, you think that it is okay to continue with the same technology. Then what will happen to you? You will not be in a position to compete with your competitors, because they have been able to bring more efficiency through technology, which you have not been able to do it. Okay. And then you think about your survival. So, what will happen? You will not be able to survive even, because nobody is going to buy your product or services, because of the efficiency that you have created, right. Look at some of the Indian organizations which have not been able to match, or they have not been able to see what kind of changes are happening in the environment, how competitors are behaving, what kind of products and services they are offering, and if you are not able to compete with them, then this is going to happen. Look at any sector, aviation, telecom, okay, consumer durables, in all kind of sectors you can find such examples where the companies have not been able to perform well, because they have not been able to look at the triggers in the environment. Say, and one example that I can take is HMT versus Titan. HMT did not go for examining the external environment, see that how the consumer tastes and preferences towards watches have changed, and they did not bring about any kind of innovations in the technology. Of late they moved from what you call from analog to digital watches, but that was not successful. Now, if you look at these examples, what this suggests, that these companies have not been able to keep pace with the changes that is happening in the immediate environment, and eventually this led to gradual decline or demise of the company. So, if you are slow, or if you are not able to say scan the environment properly, so you are not in a position to decide the need for the changes, right. So, you try to react at a later stage, but you are not successful. So, the idea of this concept is that you need to be proactive to your environment to ensure that you remain viable and competitive, and offer products or services through which you can be productive. Now, this example that I have given here is of a company known as MySpace, which was an online social networking company. It was a very successful company to start with, even surpassed Google as the most visited site at one point of time. But what happened? Look at the Google and MySpace today. Okay. MySpace could not accurately assess the changes which was happening in the environment with regard to the expectations of the technology savvy new generation youngsters, okay, and the potential customers which were moving there. Ultimately, what happens is it lost its market share to Google, okay, and ultimately the Facebook overtook it. I think the first Facebook was the major challenge. So, for MySpace it was a strategic drift, eventually decline and gradual demise happened in this case, right. So, I think I have given enough example to explain this concept. Now, related to this is that other concepts, let us discuss about it, like lead time and time pressure. See, if you are not working in time, then what will happen? It is always delayed, right. So, you need to respond to the challenges well in time, right, so that you can plan for the change, you can do things which is required, right. So, it is very difficult to change a minor change, you can say, when the need for the change is urgent, right. Suppose if you want to bring about a change in technology, say 2 years later, which other competitors are using, then is it possible for you to compete? No. So, there is less time for planning. Okay. It is more difficult to move people in the process, because people, you need to convince and take them into confidence that okay, we are going for this kind of change, why we are going for this kind of change, and you do not have time to experiment and innovate with, right. So, you also have enough time to ensure that you are able to understand the environment and take an appropriate action. If you do it in a hurry, then you will not be able to plan properly, you will not be able to take people along with you, and then it is not going to be very, very successful, right. Now, I am going to discuss about a typology which talks about continuous and discontinuous change, right, and then whether you are going to act in a proactive way or a reactive way. See, so if you look at this, on this side we have incremental and transformational change, that is continuous changes, and this side we have proactive and reactive change. What happened? If you are going to be incremental and proactive, then you go fine tuning, right. Like the example that is given here of Citibank, what Citibank did, they tried to change the system structure and processes on a continuous basis by looking at the environment, by looking at the customer needs and expectations, and how they see that how technology could be used in time to ensure efficiency, right. Now, look at another example. This is again related to proactiveness, but it is what we call is transformational or discontinuous change, like Nestle. Nestle was in another business, later on they moved to different kind of businesses. So, in 80s they tried to reorient them to a different kind of business altogether. So, they went for a total transformation of the organization. They understood the need of time and then tried to change themselves, right. So, this is what we call being proactive and going for a transformational change. The third one is incremental and reactive. When others are changing and then you try to adapt to these changes, right. So, one company has gone for a one kind of technology. So, you also think that you should go for this kind of technology. So, but it is a reactive move where you are trying to adapt to this, right. So, when Citibank went for internet banking, Citibank went for, you can say, automated teller machines to start with in the beginning, other banks also followed the suit, right, because Citibank had the first mover advantage in this case, right. So, other bank also adopted for this. Once they adopt this, then this does not provide any advantage to Citibank. But if you continuously keep on improving and noting yourself, then others are going to follow you only, right, and then you remain competitive. Now, in transformational and reactive changes are the worst kind of changes, like Asda Motors. Okay. In this case, what happens? You are not proactive, you do not look at the environment, what is happening, and then you ultimately what happens? You go for a total transformation. You recreate the business, because you change everything at the same time, because now you find that it is impossible to work with the current set of systems, structure, technology, process, culture, whatever you have. So, you go for total transformation of organization, changing everything, including products and services that you offer, looking at your technology that you have, like the kind of systems and processes that you have adopted. So, what Asda Motors did, that they tried to recreate themselves and try to identify a different identity for them by going for a total transformation. So, I hope that this typology would be able to help you to explain that what kind of changes are good and what kind of changes are not good. Now, moving further, what are the implications for these kind of changes for change managers? Now, if you look at the implications for change managers, we will have 4 different points that we need to discuss. Is that what is the focus for change effort, and who is the locus of change, who will manage the process, and then what would the steps in the change process, and finally, what is the role of change managers or change agent in the process. So, one by one we will take up very gradually. Now, if you look at the focus of the change effort, what is the focus? If you are going for a discontinuous or transformational change, then you need to, the focus of the change effort is not just a part of the organization. It is in its totality, and the entire organization is going to be the focus of the change effort, right. So, the outcome is that you are going to make different things, do different things, or doing things differently. There are 2 things, that is, does things differently or doing different things. So, you move to do different things, because the way you have been doing things earlier was not successful, right. So, the focus for the change effort, if you are moving to transformational change, is bringing about changes in all sphere of your activities, systems, structure, culture, technology, even products and services that you have been offering, right. And then now you look at this, which shows, see, we are talking about the input that is coming, the changes where it happens in the structure, technology, task, people, and the output that you have, right. So, everything it changes, the input changes, the structure goes for a change, the systems and processes you change, you also bring about a change in the people attitude and behavior, try to bring about a change in the culture, so that the output that you have is meeting the expectations of the external customers. And you also need to say that if you bring about a change in the structure, it also needs realignment with other elements of the change, right. So, it is very, very important to ensure that you are able to go for a better configuration of these things, so that you are able to produce an expected outcome for the organization. This is what actually changes in the organization, which we will discuss in the next chapter. We will talk about the scope of changes, but here what I am trying to tell you is that this is where the changes happens. So, the focus of change effort is either structure, task, culture, or people. If you are going for a continuous change, but if you discontinuous change, you go for changing everything, right. Now, moving to the next part, what is the locus of change? That is basically the intensity of change, you see whether it is less intense or more intense. In incremental change it is less intense, right. In transformational change it is most intense. So, you move just from fine tuning to adapting, the reorienting, and finally to recreation. Recreation means where you go for total transformation of the changes, right. So, this is you move from incremental to gradually transformational change, right. So, the intensity of the change depends upon what? Whether you are acting proactively or reactively, how much stress is there for you to change, right, and what is the trauma that is associated with the change. Okay. Now, the thing is that the leadership has to decide what kind of changes they need to bring in continuous changes or discontinuous changes, depending upon the requirement, and these are the different kind of changes that might happen, as we have discussed in the typology, right. And finally, if you look at the locus of change, yes, whether the change in the management process is going to be there, or you want to go through empowerment and delegation to ensure that yes, people are happy and satisfied, or you are taking external consultants and their help to see that what kind of change can be brought in, or the change is going to be led by the top managers, right. So, most of the time you will find that high intensity change are carried out by the top managers, while low intensity change is carried out by the normal management processes at the level at which the people are working, right. So, we have discussed about continuous and discontinuous change. So, you can see that look at the sequence of change. Okay. This is the sequence of change which have been discussed in the literature, and it suggests a 3-step process, starting with unphrasing, moving, and finally rephrasing. So, unphrasing, what happens that yes, there are certain forces which allow you to go for a change, right. So, you unphrase. So, unphrasing will not happen unless you maintain the status quo, right. Then next is moving. So, from one state to another state. So, this is the current state and this is the desired future state, and that is where you move or try to transform either through incremental changes or transformational changes to rephrase yourself, right. So, rephrasing, what happens? You consolidate the change, and moving, what happens? You try to achieve to go there, and then the processes and other things that you use is related to moving, how you move from this stage to this stage, right. So, this is a sequence of change, you move from one stage to another stage using certain vehicles through which tools and equipments through which you are able to institutionalize and consolidate the change that you want to bring about in the organization. For example, if you think that your structure is not good, So, you see that what are the forces which are restraining you to go for this, and if restraining forces are higher, then you do not go for a change, you do not unfreeze. If restraining forces are low, then you go for unfreezing. Okay, you think that yes, if there is a need to bring about a change in the structure, and then you think what kind of structure would be appropriate. All this is part of what you call moving, and then once you have decided about a structure, so you freeze it. Okay, this is the new structure of the organization, right. So, these are the three kind of stages that we have been talking about. Now, see what actually happens at the different stages. Those firms which are working in a high velocity means those environment which are changing very fast, they keep on doing this on a continuous basis, freezing, rebalancing and unfreezing. So, this is a different kind of sequence that have been suggested. They say that it is not that you are once you have freezed yourself, the job is over. So, it is a cyclical process. Once you have freezed, then again there is a change, you take stock of the situation, you think whether this structure is working or not, then again you move, rebalance yourself, see what needs to be done, whether you need to again go for some kind of restructuring exercise and then again unfreeze. So, instead of this kind of sequence of change which we discussed earlier, unfreezing, moving and refreezing, some of the authors have talked about that it is better to follow this kind of structure, freezing, rebalancing and unfreezing, right. And with this, with help of this, we continuously modify and improve the organization, right. Now, the most important, the final thing that we are going to discuss here is the role of change agents, right. What the change agents are doing, because they are the prime movers who initiate and manage the change, right. So, if they continuously keep stock of the situation and the environment, definitely it will make sense and they would be in a better position to interpret and understand change, and also convince the top management, take people along with them to ensure that change is implemented successfully. Okay. So, the role of change management is very important. So, conclude this first week of module. What we discussed here is the nature of change, various perspectives and image of change managers, and the different type of changes, especially in detail we talked about two kind of changes, that is incremental and continuous changes and associated things related to these two kind of changes. Thank you very much.